Hello everybody, this is Pranay and welcome to Vysh IAS. So we shall continue the Tamilnadu history textbook part 1 of class 11th, and before I start the class I request you to please like this video, please leave a one-liner comment and please share it with your friends, and as well as please WhatsApp us on this number for any information regarding the test series or any other course information, and even you can mail us. The mail ID has been provided here. So we shall continue. So we are doing the chapter number 4, Emergence of State and Empire. This is the part 2 of the video. Alexander's invasion. During the Nanda's reign, Alexander invaded northwest India around 327 to 325 BCE, during the Dhanananda's reign. In many ways, the invasion of Alexander is a watershed in Indian history. It marked the beginning of the interaction between India and the West. So, whatever the westernization of India at that point of time, the influence maybe in the politics, maybe in the art and culture. So everything the such kind of influence was at that point of time by the Alexander, which spanned in many centuries to follow. Greek historians began to write about India, and Greek governors and kings ruled in the northwestern region of India, which introduced new styles of art and governance. You see the Gandhara art, as well as Indo-Greek art. These all were usually influenced by the Western people who arrived into India from the northwestern part of the subcontinent. After his conquest in the Punjab region, Alexander expressed his desire to march further east to attack the Magadha Empire. So basically, after conquesting the Punjab region, he was trying to push it much more inside, crossing the Indus River. However, his already tired troops had heard about the great emperor in the east, the Nanda, and his formidable army, and refused to engage in a war against such a powerful adversary. So at that point of time, already these people were conquering and moving on. So the troops were tired, as well as they were far from home for couple of years, so they really wanted to go home at that point of time. So they refused, and more or less they knew about the army which was present in the India. So they knew that they have a huge army having elephants, horses, and lot of cavalry and all. So because of that reason, so they clearly refused. In 326 BCE, when Alexander entered the Indian subcontinent after defeating the Persians, Ambi, the ruler of Taxila, surrendered and accepted the suzerainty of the Alexander. The most famous of Alexander's encounters was with Porus, ruler of the region between Jhelum and Beas. Porus was the ruler between the Jhelum and the Beas. The two armies met in the Battle of Hydaspes, in which Porus was imprisoned. Later, impressed by the Porus' dignity, Alexander restored his throne on the condition of accepting his suzerainty. His battle-weary soldiers refused to march further. So at this point of time, after giving back the Porus his land, so the soldiers refused to march further. Alexander did not want to proceed against the reluctance of his army. During his return, Alexander died of typhoid in Babylon. The impact of Alexander's invasion. Alexander's invasion led to establishment of Greek satrapies in the northwestern region of Indian subcontinent. Trade routes opened up with the West. There were 4 different trade routes in use, which facilitated the movement of Greek merchants and craftsmen to India, establishing direct contact between India and Greece. So automatically there will be a distribution of culture, an exchange of culture, as well as other traditional things. As contact increased, many Greek settlements were established in the northwest part of India. Alexandria near Kabul, Bogfela near Peshawar, in Pakistan and Alexandria in Sindh were one of the most prominent Greek settlements. The Greek accounts of India provide valuable information but with a bit of exaggeration. Okay, so the books which were written by the Greeks, okay, the people of Greeks or maybe the governor of Greek, they gave a lot of information but with a lot of exaggeration. So more or less the material which we get from that point of time, not just about the Greek but as well as the Buddhist literature, maybe other Jain literature or any other literature to say, is usually exaggerated regarding themselves as well as their kings and all that. Okay, Alexander's death created a void in the northwest. So at that point of time, in the northwestern part, so no one was there who was able to take care of the people. So at that point of time, smaller kingdoms started taking place. So at that point of time, Chandragupta Maurya took the throne in the Magadha. So it helped to conquer the numerous small chiefdoms in the northwest and bring the region under his empire. Okay, so we will see about the Mauryan Empire. Contemporary accounts by Greek historians show that Chandragupta was the youth living in Takshashila when Alexander invaded India. Greek historians have recorded his name as Sandrocotus or Sandrocopetus, which are evidently modified forms of Chandragupta. Okay, inspired by Alexander, Chandragupta led a revolt against the Nandas. A year later and overthrew them. So here he was more or less alone. Okay, to rule. So there was no such competition left. Chandragupta achieved it either by inciting the people to rise against an unpopular monarch or by soliciting the support in overthrowing an unpopular king. Chandragupta established the Mauryan Empire and became its first emperor in 321 BC. Okay, we know from the Junagadh rock inscription that Chandragupta had expanded his empire westward as far as Gujarat. Okay, one of his great achievements, according to local accounts, was that waged war against the Greek prefects, military officials left behind Alexander and destroyed them, so that the way was cleared to carry out his ambitious plan of expanding the territories. So you need to understand here how northwest he was there. Okay, how northwest he went and he destroyed them and got his land back. Another major event of his reign was the war against the Seleucus, who was one of the Alexander's general. After the death of Alexander, Seleucus had established his kingdom extending up to Punjab. Okay, Chandragupta defeated him in a battle sometime before 301 BCE and drove him out of the Punjab region. Okay, the final agreement between the two was probably not too acrimonious, since Chandragupta gave Seleucus 500 war elephants and Seleucus sent an ambassador to Chandragupta's court. This ambassador was the Megasthenes, okay, which is very important. Okay, and the information through his Indica, the book named Indica. Okay, this Megasthenes is very important. Megasthenes was the ambassador in the court of Chandragupta. You need to remember this, and the book Indica. Okay, the original of this work is lost, but many Greek historians had reproduced part of his account describing the court of Chandragupta and his administration. So this was Chandragupta. This is not exactly the same guy to say, but it's through the imagination and a lot of information which we got. Okay, Chandragupta was obviously a great ruler who had to reinvent a strong administrative apparatus to govern his extensive kingdom. Okay, since it was very vastly spread, so they had to make certain arrangements to take care of the empire. Okay, Chandragupta was ably advised and aided by Chanakya, known as political maneuvering in governing his empire. Okay, we'll see about Chanakya also. Contemporary Jain and Buddhist texts hardly have any mention of Chanakya. Okay, but popular oral tradition ascribes the greatness of Chandragupta and his reign to the wisdom and genius of Chanakya. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya and Vishnugupta. Okay, you need to remember this. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya and Vishnugupta, was a Brahmin and a sworn adversary of the Nandas. He is credited with having devised the strategy for overthrowing the Nandas and helping Chandragupta to become the emperor of Magadha. He is celebrated as author of the Arthashastra. You need to remember this. Okay, so Arthashastra was written by Kautilya. Okay, it is basically a political strategy and governance book. Okay, his intrigues and brilliant strategy to subvert the intended invasion of Magadha is the theme of the play Mudra Rakshasa. Okay, this is also very important. So you need to remember the names and the books. Okay, next comes the Bindusara, who was the son of Chandragupta. Okay, Chandragupta's son Bindusara succeeded him as emperor in 297 BCE in a peaceful and natural transition. So nothing has happened here. Nobody killed somebody to get the succession. Okay, so it was a natural transition. We do not know what happened to Chandragupta, but he probably renounced the world. According to the Jain tradition, Chandragupta spent his last years as an ascetic in Chandragiri near Sravana Belagola in Karnataka. Okay, so he basically became a sannyasi. Okay, and he was there in the Karnataka. Bindusara was clearly a capable ruler and continued his father's tradition of close interaction with the Greek states of West Asia. He continued to be the advised by Chanakya and other capable ministers. Okay, Bindusara ruled for 25 years and he must have died in 272 BC. Ashoka was not his chosen successor. You need to remember this. Ashoka was not his chosen successor. Okay, and fact that he came to throne only after 4 years later in 268 BC. Okay, so there might be some struggle between all the sons. So it is said that Ashoka was the younger son, and there was somebody else who was getting the succession, but at the end, Ashoka became the emperor. Okay, Ashoka had been the viceroy of Takshashila when he put down a revolt against the local officials by the people of Takshashila, and was later the viceroy of Ujjain, the capital of Avanti. Okay, as emperor, he is credited with building the monumental structures that have been excavated in the site of Patliputra. He continued the tradition of close interaction with Greek states in West Asia, and there was a mutual exchange of emissaries from both the sides. Okay, now we will see about the Ashoka, who was one of the greatest kings in Indian history. Okay, the defining event of Ashoka's rule was his campaign against Kalinga, which is Odisha now, in the 8th year of his reign. This is only recorded military expedition of the Mauryas. Okay, so what does it say? So it does mean, like, there might have been a lot of military expeditions, but which were not recorded anywhere. Okay, the number of those killed in the battle, those who died subsequently, and those deported ran into tens of thousands. So it might be an exaggeration, but it gives the intensity. Okay, the campaign had probably been more ferocious and brutal than usual because this was a punitive war against the Kalinga, which had broken away from the Magadha Empire. The Hathigumpha inscription speaks of Kalinga as part of Nanda Empire. So what does it mean is, this Kalinga Empire broke away from the Magadha Empire. Okay, because of that, these people, the Mauryan people, had to attack it, and a lot of lives were laid down. Okay, Ashoka was devastated by the carnage and moved by the suffering that he converted to humanistic values. Okay, he became a Buddhist, and his newfound values and beliefs were recorded in a series of edicts, which confirm his passion for peace and moral rightness, or the Dhamma. which we call dharma in the Sanskrit. Okay, so in the last day of the war which was happening in the Kalinga, when he saw a lot of lives just disappeared, the dead bodies were everywhere, then he saw an ascetic, a Buddhist ascetic, a Buddhist monk who was just walking by, and after going and talking to him, he understood, like, there is a lot more than this land and conquering and all that. So at that point of time, he changed himself, and because of that reason itself, he is called one of the greatest kings. Okay. Edicts of Ashoka. The edicts of Ashoka thus constitute the most concrete source of information about the Mauryan Empire. There are 33 edicts comprising 14 major rock edicts, 2 known as Kalinga edicts, 7 pillar edicts, and some minor edicts and a few minor pillar inscriptions. Okay, so there are 33 edicts, which are 14 major, 2 Kalinga, 7 pillar, and some minor and minor pillar inscriptions. Okay, the major rock edicts extended from Kandahar in Afghanistan. You need to see how far it is. Okay, so you need to understand the influence of his empire. Shahbaz Gadi and Mansehra in northwest Pakistan, to Uttarakhand district in the north, Gujarat and Maharashtra in west, Odisha in the east, and as far south as Karnataka and Kurnool district in the Andhra Pradesh. Okay, minor pillar inscriptions have been found as far north as Nepal, okay, near Lumbini. The edicts were written mostly in Brahmi script and in Magadhi and Prakrit. Okay, Brahmi script and Magadhi and Prakrit language. The Kandahar inscriptions, which is in Afghanistan, are in Greek and Aramaic, while the 2 inscriptions in northwest Pakistan and Kharoshthi script. So you need to understand the customizability. Okay, the way he used his these inscriptions, that the local people have to understand. It's not like he was forcing them to understand the Brahmi script or anything. He was making these edicts as per the local people. Okay, the geographical spread of these edicts essentially defines the extent of the vast empire over which Ashoka ruled. The second inscription mentions the land beyond his borders, the Chodas, means the Cholas, the Pandyas. See, here we can see they were till Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. Okay, after the Kurnool in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, the part where the Kerala is at present and the Tamil Nadu is at present, they were being ruled by the Cholas at that point of time, the Pandyas, the Satyaputras, the Kerala Putras, and even Tamraparni, okay, the Yona king, Antiochus, and the kings who are the neighbors of this Antiochus. Okay, so this is image of the rock edict of Kandahar. Okay, the edict stress Ashoka's belief in peace, rightness, and justice, and his concern for the welfare of his people. See, Ashoka in his edicts and all, he specifically mentions about the the culture you need to inculcate, the way you need to behave with people, and the policies of peace, the rightness, the correctness, not doing cheats. That kind of policy was mentioned on these kind of edicts. By rejecting violence and war, advocating the peace and pursuit of Dhamma, which I just said, Ashoka negated the prevailing philosophy of statecraft that stressed that an emperor had to strive to extend and consolidate his empire through warfare and military conquest. He was against them. Okay, this is one of very important points to understand what kind of nature the Ashoka had. Okay, so this is one of the most important point. At the point of Ashoka's reign, the third Buddhist council happened. Okay, in the Patliputra. Okay, one of the major events of Ashoka's reign was the convening of the third Buddhist Sangha, the council, in 250 BC in capital Patliputra. You need to remember this. Okay, Ashoka's deepening, and with this, please let us know in the comments when was and under whom the first and second Buddhist council happened. Okay, you just let us know in the comments, and we will surely reward you at some point of time. Ashoka's deepening commitment to the Buddhists meant that the royal patronage was extended to the Buddhist establishment. An important outcome of this Sangha was the decision to expand the reach of Buddhism to other parts of region and to send missions to convert people to the religion. Okay, till now they were not spreading the Buddhism to convert. It was just like just giving information and letting know the people about the Buddhism. But after this third council, they decided to start converting to the religion, such that the religion never dies. Okay, they had a feeling that the religion may die because of very less patronage. Okay, Buddhism thus became a proselytizing religion, and missionaries were sent to regions outlying the empire, such as Kashmir and South India. So, what does proselytizing mean? It means to start converting. Okay, converting the people. Okay, according to the popular belief, Ashoka sent his two children, Mahinda and Sanghamitra, to Sri Lanka to propagate Buddhism. Okay, this Mahinda and Sanghamitra, specifically the Sanghamitra, carried the branch of the original Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka, which is Jayashree Mahabodhi in Anuradhapura, Sri Lanka. Okay, so with this branch itself, this whole tree has grown, and which is said to be called as almost like 2000 years old tree, which is very sacred to the Buddhist people in Sri Lanka. Okay, Ashoka died in 231 BC. Sadly, though his revolutionary view of governance and non-violence find a resonance in our contemporary sensibilities, they were not in consonance with the realities of the time. Okay, so he was very keen about the governance and non-violence and the Dhamma and all, but as soon as he died, his successors were not very capable to take care of the empire, okay, as well as to follow the pathway of the Ashoka. After his death, the Mauryan Empire slowly disintegrated and died within 50 years. But the 2 centuries prior to Ashoka's death and the disintegration of Mauryan Empire were truly momentous in Indian history. This was a period of great change. Okay, so we will see what exactly the Mauryan state was and what kind of polity they had. Okay, the major areas of concern for the Mauryan state were the collection of taxes as revenue to the state and administration of justice, in addition to the maintenance of internal security and defense against external aggression. Okay, this required a large and complex administrative machinery and institutions. So basically, at that point of time, since it was huge, okay, the state was divided into different provinces, and the provinces were taken care by the governors. The same way, now the India is there. Okay, you consider India as a huge state, and there are couple of states in the India. Okay, and these states are being taken care by the governors as well as the chief ministers and all. Okay, the same way, at that point of time also there was some sort of decentralization and centralization. Okay, you will see. Greek historians, taking the lead from Megasthenes, described the Mauryan state as centralized state. What we should infer from this description as a centralized state is that uniform pattern of administration was established throughout the very large area of the empire. You need to see uniform pattern of administration. In the same way, like in India, we have IAS officers, IPS officers, which you people are aspiring to become, right? So, as these IAS officers, you are almost like uniform all over the India. Okay, that's why the central services are there. Okay, in the same way, at that point of time also, a uniform pattern of administration was followed all over the state. Okay, But given the existing state of technology in communication and transport, the decentralized administrative system had to be in place. Okay. So this bureaucratic setup covered a hierarchy of settlements from the village to the towns, provincial capitals, and the major cities. Okay. The bureaucracy enabled and required an efficient system of revenue collection, since it needed to be paid out of taxes collected. Okay. Equally, the very large army of the Mauryan Empire could be maintained only with the revenue raised through taxation. Okay. The large bureaucracy also commanded huge salaries. Okay. According to the Arthashastra, the salary of chief minister, the Purohita, and the army commander was 48,000 panas, and soldiers around 500 panas. There is a huge difference. You need to see this. Okay. The difference in the salaries of an army commander and a soldier. Okay. If we multiply this by the number of infantry and cavalry, we get an idea of the enormous resources needed to maintain the army and the administrative staff. We will see about the provincial administration. At the head of the administration was the king. He was on the top. He was assisted by a council of ministers. Okay, there were council of ministers. Okay, and a purohita or a priest who was a person of great importance, and secretaries known as Mahamatriyas. Okay, the capital Patliputra was directly administered. The provinces were administered by governors who were usually royal princes. Okay, the rest of the empire was divided in 4 provinces based on Suvarnagiri, which is near Kurnool in Andhra Pradesh, Ujjain in Malwa, Avanti Malwa, Takshashila in the northwest, and Tosali in Odisha in the southeast. These were 4 provinces, and they were governed by the governors, or who were the prince basically. In each region, the revenue and the judicial administration and the bureaucracy of the Mauryan state was replicated to achieve a uniform system of governance. Revenue collection was the responsibility of Collector General Samaharta, okay, who was also in charge of exchequer, that he was in effect like a minister of finance. Okay, so Samaharta is basically Collector General who was responsible for the revenue collection. You need to remember this. Okay, these kind of terminology is very important in the view of UPSC prelims. Okay, you just take a note of it, make a small notes for each class. You might be just needing half of the paper for each episode. Okay, he had to supervise all the provinces, fortified towns, mines, forests, trade routes, and others which are sources of revenue. The treasurer was responsible for keeping a record of tax revenues. The accounts of each department had to be presented jointly by the ministers to the king. Okay, each department had a large staff of superintendents and subordinate officers linked to central and local governments. Just imagine, like it's more or less like our government. Okay, so you can just relate with a lot of officers here. Okay, next we will see about the district and village administration. At the next level administration came the districts, villages, and towns. The district was under the command of Sthanika. Okay, the district was under the command of Sthanika, while officials known as Gopas were in charge of 5 to 10 villages. Understand in this way, he is the district officer. You call him district collector or magistrate or whatever it is, while the officials known as Gopas were in charge of 5 to 10 villages. Okay, you call him mandal officer, or you just see in that way. Okay, just try to link them with your own imagination with the present scenario, and they might be easily rememberable. Okay, and urban administration, the cities, was handled by Nagarika, the municipal commissioner. Call him the municipal commissioner. Okay, in that way. Okay, villages were semi-autonomous and under the authority of Gramani. Okay, villages, okay, appointed by the central government and a council of village elders. Okay, there was involvement of central government as well as the council of village elders. Agriculture was then, as it remained down the centuries, the most important contributor to the economy. Okay, and the tax on agriculture produce constituted the most important source of revenue. Usually the king was entitled to 1/6 of the produce, In reality, it was often much higher, usually about 1/4 of the produce. Okay. What kind of sources were there of the revenue? The Arthashastra recommended comprehensive state control over agriculture production and marketing, with warehouses to store agriculture products and regulate markets in order to maximize the revenues from this most important sector of the economy. Okay. Other taxes include taxes on land, on irrigation, if the sources of irrigation had been provided by the state, taxes on urban houses, customs, tolls on goods transported over trade, and profits from coinage and trade operations carried on by the government. Okay, so more or less, just compare the whole thing with the present India, and you may see, like, more or less we are following the same thing now. Okay, lands owned by the king, forests, mines, and manufacture and salt on which state had a monopoly were also important source of revenue. Okay, so we'll see about the judicial administration. Justice was administered through courts, which were established in all major towns. Okay, so there were two type of courts. The dharmasthya courts mostly dealt with civil law. Okay, dharmasthya was related with civil law relating to marriage, inheritance, and other aspects of civil life, what we call a civil court these days. Okay, the courts were presided over by 3 judges as well as versed in sacred laws, and 3 amatyas, who were the secretaries. Okay, the kantaka sodhana, removal of thorns, also presided over by 3 judges and 3 amatyas. So these were basically more or less like criminal courts. Okay, so this was to clear the society of antisocial elements and various type of crimes, and it functioned more like a modern police and relied on a network of spies for information about such antisocial activities. Okay, punishment for crimes were usually quite severe. The overall objective of the judicial system as it evolved was to extend government control over the most aspects of ordinary life. You may have seen, like, Ashoka had a torture room too. You can see it on Google. Like, there was some sort of torture room where these kind of criminal people were taken care. Okay, you need to understand. Okay, so that's all for today. So next we will see the Ashoka's dharmic state. What was Dhamma, and what was Ashoka's dharmic state, and what he really wanted to make, and the economic society, the urbanization, and art and culture. And because of the influence and amalgamation of different cultures, so there was a lot of growth in the art and culture sector, as well as the urbanization also. So there were many aspects where the urbanization took place. Okay, so that's all for today, and I request you to please like the video and please leave a one-liner comment. This will encourage us to put lot more free content on the channel, and share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel if you are new here. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you. That's all.